Well, we've been following Matthew's story of Jesus for several months now, starting back at the beginning of Advent. And we picked up on the fact now for sure that Jesus primarily taught in telling parables, stories that had a moral, but they were metaphorical in their intent. So today, here we are, we're with Jesus in Jerusalem. We're in the midst of what's called now, for us Christians, Holy Week, Jesus' last week of his life. And we find that even here at the very end, he continues to teach in parables. And today it's a most pointed parable, you might call it. It's the parable of the wicked tenants. We all heard the parable of the wicked tenants, and maybe we're all cringing wherever we may be. To make this sad and somewhat gruesome story short, here's this parable that we just heard in a nutshell, a 20-word nutshell. A landowner rents out his land to tenants. The tenants refuse to pay the rent, the first fruits, at harvest time. That's the story. Now this parable, as I said, was pointed, all right? It was pointed right at the chief priests and the Pharisees who were hearing it for the first time. And they learned something about Jesus' parables in their encounter in that moment. Yes, the parables, I said, are windows that allow us to glimpse into life in the kingdom. They are certainly windows. But they are also, paradoxically, mirrors. They are mirrors that reflect back on us. In fact, they're mirrors that reflect us to ourselves and allow ourselves, in fact, demand of ourselves, that we look at our life and craft it in a way that is befitting of the standards and principles of God's kingdom that the parables were about. So here's a question for us to think about this morning. It appears that the parable of the tenants ended up serving as a mirror for the chief priests and the Pharisees who heard it. But what is that parable for you and for me today, right now? Well, that parable is a mirror. It's a mirror in which we take a long, hard look at ourselves. Perhaps you're about ready to perceive a personal affront, rise up in righteous indignation wherever you may be, and scream, "But we haven't beaten or stoned anybody. It can't be about us." But look closely. See more clearly. The parable discloses a fundamental truth about who we are. You see, we also are tenants. We're stewards. We've been entrusted with the use of something that ultimately is the possession of its rightful owner. And that something with which we have been entrusted is everything. All that we have, all that we are, all that we might ever hope to be. The world we live in, our possessions, our church, our very selves. This is all the vineyard which has been entrusted to us for just a little while. And the legal title to all this is not nearly so clear as we might think, nor is it as lasting as we might sometimes be led to believe. The 19th century Polish rabbi, Hofez Chaim, was renowned throughout the world in his day. People came from the four corners of the earth to Warsaw just to learn from him for a few minutes. On one occasion, a person from America, a pilgrim from our own country, appeared at Hafez Chaim's door. When the American entered the house, he was astonished to find just a simple, single little room. books and little else. A small table, a bench, and a mat on the floor. The visitor looked around and he said to the rabbi, "Rabbi, where's your furniture?" The rabbi looked back at the pilgrim and said to him, "Where is yours?" "Mine?" asked the puzzled American pilgrim. "I'm just a visitor here. I'm just passing through." And Rabbi Chaim replied, "So am I." We're tenants, temporary stewards. We're just passing through. All that we think that we have is not, in the end, really ours. It has been entrusted to our care by the owner of the vineyard. And the trap, the temptation, the point of struggle for me and perhaps for you, comes when we lead ourselves to believe that we're entitled to all we have. And that's when our priorities get all out of whack. And we need all the help we can get to keep us on the right path, to keep our priorities straight. Well, some additional help fell into our laps this morning in the form of St. Paul's letter to the Philippians that Bob read for us just a moment ago. The Apostle Paul is in prison in Rome in the last days of his life, which he knows. And he reflects back on all that he had accomplished in his eventful life, all that he had accumulated in his life. And then he made a startling confession. As he looked back, he said to himself and to us, "Whatever gains I had, I have come to regard as loss because of Christ. More than that, I regard everything as loss because of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things, and I regard them as rubbish." Rubbish. Trash. Now, the truly startling nature of St. Paul's confession is lost on us because the translators of the Bible didn't think that we could stand the truth. The word that we heard translated as rubbish is what might be called a euphemism. The word, used only this one time in all the Bible, is the Greek word skubalon. Skubalon. And it means something much more elemental than mere rubbish or trash. A more literal translation of the word that St. Paul used here is that he was equating all his accomplishments and all his acquisitions to the stuff that would typically be found in a septic tank. It would seem that his experience of the risen Christ led St. Paul to a fundamental reordering of his priorities, even right at the end of his life. And you know, life experiences can sometimes do that for us, can't they? Glenn Adsit and his wife and his 2 young children left the United States of America, their native land, for China as Christian missionaries back in the 1930s. They served there for over 20 years. When the communists came to power in 1949, they knew that their days in China were coming to an end. Sure enough, one evening, some soldiers came to their house and informed them that they were going to be leaving China and heading back to America the very next morning. And the soldiers told Glenn Adsit and his wife, "You may take only 200 pounds of stuff with you. 200 pounds of your own choosing, and that is all you can take back." Well, that evening was spent with the couple haggling over what was the most important things in their life. Of course, Glenn needed his new typewriter. His wife insisted on taking a valuable vase that a dear Chinese friend had given her. They made choices. They argued. They weighed everything precisely on the bathroom scales. And when the soldiers arrived at their house the next morning, Glenn and his wife had everything packed carefully in 3 neat boxes, 200 pounds to the ounce. One of the officers asked them, "Have you weighed everything?" "Yes," they replied confidently. And then the officer looked at them and said, "Have you weighed the children? Have you weighed the children?" Weigh the children? Well, of course they hadn't weighed the children. The children had been a given. The children had just been taken for granted. And in an instant, the priorities of Glenn and his wife were turned upside down. Or rather, they were turned right side up. The new typewriter and the valuable antique Chinese vase, they instantly became trash, rubbish, and they were left behind without a second thought. Glenn and his wife returned to America with only the clothes on their back and with their precious little children enveloped carefully in their loving arms. We all need experiences like this from time to time because we can lose sight of what really matters. And then we cease to be thankful. We become entitled. We lose sight of what's really important in life, and we fall into the sin of ingratitude, just like those tenants in the parable. That's why a life of Christian stewardship is such an important part of the spiritual journey that we're all on. One that's active and involves sharing with God from the first fruits with which God has entrusted us. It's a liberating, saving journey of abject gratitude. Thanksgiving for what we've been entrusted with. A journey that keeps us close in a very healthy relationship with the owner of the vineyard in which we find ourselves. As the 18th century poet, artist, and mystic William Blake put it, gratitude is heaven itself. Gratitude is heaven itself. And if we can let go of the sense of entitlement that envelops us, we find gratitude and therefore we find God, because gratitude is heaven itself. That's why we need startling assertions like the one with which St. Paul blessed us just this morning as we seek to be faithful Christian stewards in the priorities we set and the decisions that we make. We can be reminded of the stories of our faith. Stories like the story of Glenn Adsick, and stories like the powerful parable that Jesus told about the wicked tenants that is pointed in our direction just like a mirror this very morning.